Okay, let's begin. Do you want to start with Weber?
All right. You want me to talk about Weber
Yeah, let's start with Weber.
and
Freud.
Freud and Charles Taylor? And I think the one very important point that gives these people a common heritage, or they give us a common heritage, is that they have inherited the Enlightenment idea of an age of reason, but they don't see reason as liberationist. In other words, if you could almost say that they agree with Freud. He says, when he says, we may be looking for answers to questions outside of reason, outside of science, but they won't be found. But that doesn't mean that science will give you all the answers. So none of them are liberationists. Weber, for example, has no idea of progress. We know that we've moved from traditional society to modern society, but he never says which is better. I think he would probably think it's a silly question. So none of them, all of them have inherited the rationalism of the Enlightenment, but not its optimism and its idea of progress. So the Enlightenment without progress. Taylor is a bit different. Taylor, what makes Taylor interesting is he has considerable respect for modernity, but he ties it more closely to Christianity than anyone else, you know. So
More closely than Weber?
no, he thinks that a lot of what modernity is after is valid. It comes from Christian roots, like the idea of the self. The idea of the self is a Christian idea, and so on. And that's far more central to Taylor than it is to Weber. Rationalism is instrumental reason is all powerful, highly destructive.
Where do you think he takes that idea of instrumental reason from? Or what is that for him?
Where does the idea of instrumental reason come from?
Like, is it the scientific revolution? Is that what he's talking about?
Scientific and technological. You have to understand with Weber is that when he talks about capitalism, which he thinks is one of the great products of the Christian West, he's not talking about entrepreneurship. He's talking about organization. So capitalism, I think his definition, I don't remember the exact wording, but it has to do with the mobilization of free labor.
Mm-hmm.
That's what capitalism is. Because of Weber, it's very hard to see great capitalist enterprises as expressions of freedom. They're massive organizations. Exxon and all that is bigger than most states, So that is the first thing to remember about Weber, is that capitalism is a type of organization, and it's a new type because it mobilizes free agents.
What does this have to do with instrumental reason?
It is instrumental insofar as its aim is efficiency. So because its aim is efficiency and utility, it doesn't have higher ends. So, for example, if Walmart's can organize things to sell cheaper, then it wipes out the whole. I mean, what Weber recognizes is this instrumental rationality is quite revolutionary.
So how does he define that as being? Like you say that it doesn't have a higher end. Is that the point?
No, it's a revolution. It's rationality of means. Mm-hmm. It means that things are made more and more efficient. And when you work in a hospital, say, or a major corporation, the amount of time that is spent in analyzing what you're doing is
university as well, right?
a university in analyzing what you're doing, having committees, restructuring. Restructuring is almost the hymn of capitalism, which is guided by instrumental reason. So there is a big question in Weber. What does he mean by rationality of ends? That you have reason of ends. But what Weber describes, and you can see why he has such respect for Marx, is so obviously true, that I don't think you can understand the world without him,
But how does that instrumental reason have to do with? Because it's got to do with the Protestant, the active ascetic, and all that, right? So, or is it that it grows out of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. How does the Protestant ethic contribute to? So, off the top of my head, I'll say one: Protestantism, in its Calvinist form, emphasizes the distance between human beings and divinity and God. So, that being the case, there's no room for religious manifestations between God and human beings. So everything is, you might say, secular. Everything is what it is. Forests are forests. They're not domains of magic. So you might say nothing around you is a domain of magic. Now, people have misinterpreted Calvin, especially environmentalists, as saying you can do what you want with it. You can piss all over it. It's just nothing. And Calvin doesn't say that. He says it's your responsibility. It's human responsibility. So human responsibility means that working on and perfecting what you've been given is your main aim in life. And so that, of course, leads to capitalism. But capitalism, if you take the pure idea in Weber's terms, is not simply greed. I mean, that's one of its illusions. I always tell my students, if you look at the cover of Time magazine and they feature a Bill Gates or a Rockefeller and so on, and you read the story, what is staggering is how hard they work. Rockefeller is up at 5 a.m. doing an hour of exercises before his first conversation in Japan. And Japan, and these people run around all day. So labor, becomes one of the features of modern capitalism, almost constant labor. So the amount of money that you make is very important, but it's not why you're doing it.
But it seems like there's a difficult thing to kind of bring together. Like on the one hand, there's this Enlightenment, Age of Reason, modernity, disenchantment, secularization, and then the other in Weber, Weber is the most to say, no, this is all a religious idea.
Yes, well, Weber makes religion his center, especially in describing two things: the relations between East and West, and the relations between tradition and modernity. So the different religions have different concepts of capitalism. That's where he puts his finger, how valid is it to spend your time making money, and how valid is just labor. And he comes out with this idea, very, very general idea, that in the East, religiosity is a receptacle. That's mysticism, opening yourself up to the divine, meditation, and you go for a state of doing nothing, you know. That's the highest form in life. And the different religions have different responses to that situation. That the basic religious idea is to receive divinity and to put yourself in an ethos that does receive divinity. Whereas in the West, the basic religious idea is agency, that you are a kind of partner of God in making a world that's not magic.
Is that the West, or is that just Protestant? I mean, is that Protestant, or is it
It is throughout the West.
like with Judaism?
Judaism, yeah, but Protestantism perfected it.
So how do we see it in Judaism, for example?
Well, he has a whole book on Judaism.
Yeah.
So Judaism is monotheistic. All idols, magic was absolutely forbidden in Judaism. The Bible has a whole packet of thing that you'll come to. When King Saul consults the witch of Endor, that's considered he's disobeying his own laws.
Because there's supposed to be this one transcendent God. What's the idea
Yeah, there is one transcendent God, and the others, there's no other divinity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Bible by itself is not entirely consistent on that matter, but that's the basic idea.
And so with that, you get agency? I mean, I'm not sure how the whole thing
Well, with that,
together.
you have therefore the relationship with God is a covenant, a partnership between God and human beings. And it's not filling yourself with the divine, you know. Even Jewish mysticism, which is so popular now, much studied, the idea of doing things, what happens in the upper spheres is reflected in the lower spheres, which you should read. Jeremy and I were reading it by Adam Hirsch, one of my favorite writers, on different concepts of Judaism. So he has a good chapter on mysticism. But that's it, that mysticism is very active in Judaism, whereas it's not in other religions.
So, like, what's the big break of Protestantism? I mean, is the idea that, I mean, obviously for Weber, it must be that this instrumental reason and rationalization and Luther and modernity are all part of the same package somehow.
Yes, well, in medieval Christianity, they're both mixed together. You know, the old idea of receiving God and magic, and the new ideas of God is instrumentality. So that's medieval Christianity. And with Protestantism, there's a break, you know. So with Weber, it's very interesting to see his accounts of medieval cities and so on. But to give you a good example, the medieval monastery. The medieval monastery is a very rational place. Mm-hmm. There are prayers at 4 a.m., there's work at 5 a.m., there's, you know, and the bells ring for prayers. It's a rationally structured, and that opens the door to the modern state and the modern corporation.
But I guess like this Luther sort of thing against like the sacrament or something like
that
would be
part of that, certainly.
This big break, like he's seeing a break in Luther, right?
Well, the big break is that the church has any religious significance. The church is, for Luther, it's a club.
No, but for Weber, what's the big break?
Between...
Why Protestant? Like, what's the big thing in Protestant in particular? You know, if this stuff is visible in monotheism throughout the West, why Protestant becomes so important?
Well, of course, his most famous book is the Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, is that nothing in the world is divine. That's Protestantism. When you say that of the church, you're saying it of everything. So nothing in the world is divine. If you have a church, it's a club. You like to get together. Like Weber's idea of a clergyman. If someone wants to be a rabbi or a priest, yeah, go ahead, put on the thing. You lead the congregation singing, you give sermons, but it's not a profession. You know, it's not there for life. You can then give it up, whereas that's not the case in Catholicism. You join a holy order. There's no such thing as a holy order in Protestantism.
So I guess that if you have this thing of nothing is divine, that allows for this kind of age of reason more.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to study the relations between the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, you know, because they took place at the same time. But Calvinism was far more sympathetic to science than other religions, even though the scientific revolution began in Catholic countries. You see it spreading, like Descartes was a defender of Catholicism, never lived in a Catholic country, you know.
So what do you think? I mean, what do you think about this idea that? I mean, again, it seems like there's a slightly contradictory idea. One is that modernity is secular and disenchantment is secular, and the other is no, this is actually just a really religious idea. It's a Protestant idea.
I think that Protestant paved the way for it, you know, in which the clergy has no special status versus the divine, that its sacraments and so on have no special status, that your labor is just as important, secular or religious. I mean, it's very complicated in Protestantism because they do separate the church and the state. But once you have all these things, to my mind, Christianity began this whole process by separating the secular and the religious, because in Christian, even Catholicism, there are secular orders, you know, in monasteries, and religious orders.
What does that mean?
A secular order is a group of monks and nuns and all that who administer health, you know, the social worky. And then there's one that just prays.
Is that where this term secular comes from?
Yes. Saeculum is the Latin word for every day. You know.
How old is that?
The word of saeculum, it begins with Christianity. The secular is just means the everyday. It's in Hebrew too. You have hakodesh v'chol, the holy and the regular. But in Christianity, it's within a system that the secular orders. So secular religious is even within Catholicism. In Protestantism, then the secular becomes a sphere of its own. It becomes basically everything. There isn't a religious sphere.
Yeah, so it's not like, it's not that in doing this every day, you're removed from religion. It's that the religion is within the everyday or something.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Religion is in labor, primarily. But there's also, it comes to the question of religious organization. In Protestantism, you don't have hierarchies. So then you're on your way to democracy. So you have a number of the things that we consider secular in Protestantism, but the most important is the separation of church and state. the church is a voluntary organization where you administer your soul. The state has to do with garbage removal. Now, in Protestantism and Lutheranism, that is seen as a great evil. The Lutherans still cope with that. Means that the activity of the state is meaningless, just collecting garbage and keeping the streets clean. It has no higher meaning, you know. Calvinism is a bit different. It's a bit more, America is Calvinist, Sweden is Protestant, you know, so is Lutheran. It's in Weber's book. You should read it again now. The differences between Luther and Calvin are very important.
So you're in broad agreement with Weber.
I am, yes, except that I don't think it works out on a one-to-one basis. The Catholicism had a lot more capitalism and a lot more science than Weber admits.
But the
basic thesis looks pretty good when you look at Europe in the 18th century. You have England as a scientific country. You have Germany as scientific, you know.
But even now, like, would you say a lot of the workings out of modernity is a Protestant?
That I can't say for certain. Modernity, well, it looks more Chinese now than anything else, yeah.
We moved to Freud. I mean, how did you teach Freud? What was it that Freud...
Well, Freud, the big period of Freudianism was when I was in New York in the late 50s. Freud was the god of the secular world. Everyone was under psychoanalysis, you know, and so on. Freud was the great emancipation, though it had been modified, and the Oedipus complex and all that kind of stuff. But what people liked about Freud, what liberal people liked about Freud, was that, one, there was a deep, dark self. Freud's self was not shallow. You know, it was filled with conflict and so on, as exemplified in the Oedipus complex. And it seemed to, it was scientific, but also had a darker idea of the self, which made it very popular. The two ideas in Freud were, A, that religious phenomena had this erotic background, this in the first parts of civilization and its discontents, that the babies seeking nipples were the source of mysticism. And the great idea of Freud, I think, which appears in other people, is that there's a constant battle between eros and thanatos. I mean, this is the idea of Freud that all of medicine is thrown out, but it seems to me the most plausible, that there is a constant battle between eros and thanatos. World War I, he came to the idea of thanatos, a death wish. And here's where I find Freud more useful and arguable, that at the end of World War I, which he initially supported, he came to the idea of thanatos, the death wish, because nobody could find any reason for such a slaughter. Nobody could find it. It was just a pure idea of death. And you'll find even in psychology, most of the ideas of aggression around World War I were centered on this death wish, that there's no reason except self-destruction. So that's thanatos. So
how does he explain that? He just says that's just part of human psychology.
That's the two basic instincts. Eros, which is the desire for good life and pleasure, and thanatos. And they're both kind of warring with each other. So the only thing that civilization can do is to enhance and increase eros, that you have lives filled with ordinary pleasure. In other words, it wasn't religious, that you become a mystic, picking flowers. Sexuality should be normal, you know. He wasn't a Marcusian. We should sniff each other, and so on. So that was, I think, the interesting idea. Now, his pessimism was that in modern civilization, the possibilities of just plain pleasure were disappearing because people had to work so hard, go on subways all day, stuff like that. That part of Freud was just Austrian snobism, and I think was, T.S. Eliot has it. That whole idea that modern life, industrial life, is becoming impossible. But that was the basic thing in Freud, to be able to achieve a life of ordinary pleasure.
So how did you teach? I mean, what's it? Why is it important in thinking about religion? Why was Freud?
Well, first of all, Freud's idea was those ideas which enhance the death wish were destroying civilization, and the main idea that was destroying civilization was Pauline Christianity. Because Pauline Christianity gave as an ideal to love your enemies. Loving your enemies is such a crackpot idea that it destroys people's lives. Seeking that kind of love. So Freud, kind of wanted a philosophy of exalted pleasure. He had destroyed the West.
So is it like a Nietzschean thing? He's a Nietzschean?
Yeah. Oh, very much. Nietzsche, Freud loved Nietzsche when he discovered him. So it's a Nietzschean idea that, so Freud was less into ecstasy, than Nietzsche. There's an idea of sober pleasure and good life and useful life. I think that's very good. In the 60s, when I saw all these kids looking for ecstasy instead of good food, So Freud's ideals of how you fight Thanatos are, I think, valid.
It also seems relevant in this thing about that Freud sort of takes all the bits of magic and spirituality and everything and then just folds it into this self that you can have scientific understanding of, right? Like he probably thought psychoanalysis was a science, right?
Yeah.
Did he? I mean, I'm not sure about that. Did he?
No, he thought that they would come to something like physiology,
Psychoanalyst.
Yeah. A person to read for you and for me too is Jonathan Lear. He's a philosopher, a good philosopher, Aristotle, but also a professional psychoanalyst.
And writes about
Freud.
Yeah, but I think that also seems to be. I mean, certainly this essay, The Uncanny, seems a lot like that, right? That you sort of see things like ghosts and doubles and things like, but actually it's just your internal psychology, right? So everything that was thought of as magical is actually just
manifestations of the self. Well, that's what brings. Maybe we should watch one of Charles Taylor's lectures.
Sure. Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the value of Freud to me, that to seek a life of wholesome pleasure is a lot tougher and made impossible by Christianity. That was Freud's
just this particular. It's not a monotheistic thing, and I mean, what about his own relation to his Judaism? I mean, did he see it? Is that it was a Christian thing, or was it a monotheistic thing?
No, it was just national pride. Freud, since the Jews were persecuted, he stood with them, but there's nothing religious.
Right. So he doesn't see this.
He belonged to B'nai B'rith. He was an active Jewish,
But you don't think there's any sort of this issue about religion for him is.
Religion. Well, you have to read his greatest book and the commentary on it, Moses and Monotheism.
Is that what you taught?
Yeah, the disappearance of Moses, and that is